It was a cold night in Pennsylvania, the kind of night where the fog seems to swallow everything, making the empty road feel quiet and eerie, except for the distant hum of car headlights. I had just been hired as a receptionist at a remote motel, tucked away deep in a dense forest, far from any big city. The kind of place no one visits unless they really need somewhere to rest. At first, it seemed simple enough. Just a regular job. Check in guests, hand out keys, make sure everything was in order. But soon I realized this place wasn't as ordinary as it seemed. The motel, called Pine Hollow, was small, only 20 rooms, but it felt larger than it actually was. The hallways were long and narrow, with flickering fluorescent lights that made the place feel darker than it should have been. The reception area was in a corner, a tiny room with an old wooden desk and a chair that creaked with every movement. The smell of the place was peculiar, a mix of mildew and something stronger, maybe the old wood that held the building together, or the dampness that never seemed to go away. The manager, a middle-aged man with a forced smile, handed me the rule book before leaving me alone. He told me that the night shift would be quiet, that I wouldn't need to worry about anything, but he quickly warned me about the rules. Strange, but necessary. First, there was a cleaning schedule. I wasn't allowed to clean rooms during the night, not even the empty ones. Only during the day, from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. I frowned but accepted it. The reason? He didn't say. It wasn't something you asked about. The second rule was about room 13. Never rent it out, he said, and don't go in there under any circumstances. He looked dead serious and didn't offer any explanation. That room was always reserved in the system, though I never saw anyone going in or out. When I asked why, he just gave me a strange smile and said, "It's better not to know." And lastly, the strangest rule of all, never ask about the last guest. And who was the last guest? I asked, more out of curiosity than anything else. The manager looked at me, his eyes cold and unreadable. "Trust me, you don't want to know." With that, he left me alone. I settled behind the counter and started flipping through the rule book, trying to distract myself from the growing unease creeping up on me. The silence was deafening, and the dim light from the bulbs cast shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. Nothing felt normal here, but I needed the job, and I had to convince myself I was just being paranoid. The first hour passed without incident. No guests showed up. I sat there, staring out the reception window, watching the empty road and the dark forest. It was as if time had stopped in Pine Hollow. Then, finally, the sound of a car approaching broke the silence. The vehicle pulled up to the motel entrance, a beat-up van with faded paint. A couple got out of the car. Both seemed ordinary, but there was something about them that made me hesitate. The man looked at me as he approached the reception, his gaze empty, as if he knew more about this place than I did. I tried to smile and said, "Good evening. How can I help you?" The man smiled, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. He glanced at his wife, who was silent, her eyes fixed on the floor. "We need a room, please," he said, offering no further words. I quickly typed into the system, glancing at the computer screen. As expected, room 13 was marked as reserved. The rest of the rooms were empty. Everything seemed normal. I handed them the key to room 7 and watched as they walked down the hallway. The man, still with that strange look, didn't say another word. When he passed through the door, his wife only nodded slightly. I stood there, frozen, watching them. Something felt off, but what could I do? It was only the first shift. The door slammed shut, and then, suddenly, I heard a sound coming from the hallway, a whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded urgent, as if someone was asking for help. I looked back at the system. Room 13 was still marked as reserved, but who had reserved it? The receptionist hadn't mentioned anything else about that room. I felt like something was about to happen, and that the first shift was just the beginning of something much stranger and more terrifying. The clock on the wall by the reception read midnight, but time seemed distorted, as if the night would never end. I was starting to get used to the silence that filled the place, the feeling that something, somewhere, was watching. But curiosity has always been stronger than fear, and that unsettling feeling was slowly consuming me. The minutes dragged on, and the only sounds that broke the silence were the distant headlights of passing cars on the road and the muffled sound of doors closing in faraway rooms. I stared at the computer screen, waiting for another guest to arrive, when a tapping on the reception window made me jump out of my chair. It was a soft sound, but rhythmically persistent. I looked toward the window, but there was no one there. The motel was empty, except for the couple who had checked into room 7. The hallway lights flickered again, and the silence was suffocating. That's when I saw it. Room 13, the one that was never supposed to be rented, the one that was always reserved, was now showing the key had been removed from the system. My heart raced. I knew this wasn't possible. I knew the manager had been clear. Room 13 should never be rented. The computer screen still displayed the room number, but the guest's name was blank. How could this have happened? Who would have made this reservation? My mind raced, trying to understand, trying to justify the impossible. Curiosity pulled me to the back of the reception area, where the dark hallway stretched ahead, interrupted only by the weak, flickering light. I hesitated, but something tugged me forward. Something was wrong, but I couldn't stop myself. Fear and curiosity collided inside me, creating an uncontrollable urge to solve this mystery. I passed the utility room, the empty rooms, until I reached the door to room 13. The key was still there, hanging on the reception panel. I grabbed it, feeling a chill run down my spine. The weight of the key felt more symbolic than real. Something inside me screamed that I shouldn't touch it, but it was too late. The door to room 13 was slightly ajar, as if someone had purposely left it open, inviting me in. I knew I shouldn't, but my hand was already on the doorknob. As I opened it, the temperature immediately dropped. A wave of cold air wrapped around me, and the smell of mildew intensified, as though the room had been harboring something for a long time. Inside, the atmosphere was completely different from the other rooms. The old carpet, the damp smell, and the walls covered in dark stains. None of it was normal. But what disturbed me the most was the sound. Something was whispering. It wasn't a clear sound, but an indistinct murmur coming from the farthest corner of the room. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew it wasn't right. I didn't want to go any further. My instinct screamed at me to leave as quickly as possible, but something urged me to take another step. With my heart pounding in my chest, I glanced around. The room was empty, but the sensation that someone was there, watching, wouldn't go away. The bed was unmade, the curtains drawn haphazardly, as if someone had hurriedly tried to leave. But what unsettled me the most was the painting on the wall. A strange portrait of a man with an empty stare, almost leaking something I didn't want to see. The painting seemed to be staring back at me. The whisper grew louder, and then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence was deafening. It was in that exact moment that I heard a noise coming from the reception. The sound of heavy footsteps, followed by labored breathing. Someone was approaching. At first, I thought it was the couple from room 7, but the sound wasn't natural. The breathing seemed wrong. Something was terribly off. I rushed out of room 13, but as I turned to head back to the reception, I came face to face with a figure, a tall man with a piercing gaze, standing in the middle of the hallway. He didn't say a word. He just watched me. I froze. I didn't know if he was a guest, part of the place, or something different. He seemed to know I had entered room 13. How? How did he know? The tension in the air was palpable. The man took a step forward, and before I could say anything, he vanished into the darkness of the hallway, as if he had merged with the shadows themselves. There was no sound of footsteps. He simply disappeared. I was about to run back to the reception when a voice came from room 13. It wasn't the same whisper as before. This was something clearer, more distinct. "Don't touch the painting. I froze. I didn't know if it was a warning or a threat, but I knew one thing. The rules of this motel weren't just strange, they were real, and probably much more dangerous than I had imagined. I barely managed to sleep that night. When I finally slumped into the chair at the reception, the weight of what had happened smothered me. Room 13, the voice, the painting. How could something so simple create so much tension? But more than that, the man in the hallway. What did he want from me? How did he know what I had done? Every time I closed my eyes, the image of the painting came back, its empty eyes watching me, chasing me. I stayed until dawn with the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for my next move. The motel's rules. The rules that had seemed to make so much sense when the manager explained them began to distort. Were they just words? Or were they a warning against something far more sinister? It was almost as if there was a hidden language within these rules. Each one seemed to reflect something I didn't fully understand yet. Something inside me told me that everything here was interconnected. The discomfort, the mysterious guests, the painting in room 13, it all seemed like one big trap. By the end of that morning, the manager arrived for the morning shift as if nothing had happened. He walked in, smiling as always, unaware of what I had discovered. I watched him as he went to his desk, grabbing the reports and lighting a cigarette with the calm of someone who had no idea what was really happening here. When he saw me looking at room 13, his eyes narrowed. You went in there, didn't you?" he asked, without any surprise. I didn't know how to answer. He seemed to know I had broken the most important rule. Never enter room 13. How did he know? But before I could ask, he continued, "There are things in this motel we don't understand. Things we have to respect, or the cost will be high." I furrowed my brow. "What do you mean by that?" He sighed, snuffing out his cigarette with a swift motion. "That painting, it's not just a picture. When someone enters room 13, the painting chooses a victim. You heard what it said, didn't you?" I remembered the phrase, "Don't touch the painting." That's it. The painting chooses the victims. The rules here exist to prevent it from spreading. The voices, the whispers, they come from others, from those who challenge the rule, those who didn't leave in time. And now, you'll have to pay the price. The manager spoke as if he had seen all this before. I wanted to scream, ask how he knew, but the words wouldn't come. I felt as if I were trapped, as if the conversation had already been written before I ever got here. "So, what happens now?" I asked, my voice almost breaking. "Now," he said with a forced smile, "you have to follow the rules. It's no longer about what you want or what you think is right. Room 13 has already made its choice." Panic spread throughout my body. I didn't know what to do or what to say. A sense of helplessness took over me. I was trapped in this cycle with a new and terrible understanding that something invisible, and perhaps older than I could ever imagine, was behind everything. That smile on the manager's face disappeared as quickly as it had come, and he looked at me with seriousness. "Tonight, you'll have to follow the rules, or the consequences will be worse than you can imagine." I watched him, trying to process. He seemed sincere, but his words were terrifying. What did he mean by worse? The daylight seemed to protect me, but night would be different. The afternoon passed in a blur. I couldn't take my eyes off room 13, and the clock seemed to slow down. I didn't know what to expect or what to do. What were these consequences? What would happen if I didn't follow the rules? I didn't know, but one thing was clear. I couldn't leave that motel without understanding what was going on. As night fell, once again, the hallway lights started flickering. The sound of doors closing grew more frequent, as if the motel itself was getting ready for something. And with the night came a new guest. The same guest from room 13. But this time, he didn't look like the same man I saw before. He was different, dirty, with wide eyes, like he'd just woken up from a nightmare. I knew I shouldn't get closer, but the rules were pulling me down the same path. I wanted to understand, why was he here? What was happening to him? I was about to ask, but the voice from the hallway froze me in place. You can't escape your choices. Now it's too late. I froze. The man from room 13 was standing in front of me, but he didn't look human. His face was pale, his eyes bulging, and his mouth moved strangely. He was trying to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. And then I heard a different voice, one that didn't come from the man's mouth. It was a muffled voice, filled with anguish, coming straight from room 13. You're next. I was frozen, not knowing what to do. The voice, coming from inside room 13, seemed to echo in my ears, like a whisper that couldn't be ignored. The man in front of me, his eyes locked on mine, said nothing, but his expression was clear. He was warning me about something I couldn't understand. I looked at room 13, the door wide open, the dim light shining from within like a beacon calling to me. The rules were clear, and I knew that if I went in, there would be consequences. But staying also felt like a death sentence. I could feel the man's eyes on me, his gaze deep and addicting. He knew what I was about to do. You already know what happens, he murmured, still not moving his lips. His voice seemed to come from somewhere far away. It's not you who chooses, it's him. I couldn't understand. Who was he? The manager? The painting? The man standing in front of me? But the answer came faster than I expected. The door to room 13 slammed shut violently, a bang that echoed through the motel corridors, and the light went out. Panic spread through me. But before I could react, I heard footsteps coming from the hallway. These weren't the normal footsteps of guests. There was nothing natural about this walk. It was heavy, dragging, as if the ground was being crushed under an unbearable weight. I looked at the man in front of me, but he was no longer there. In his place stood a dark figure, a distorted shape of a human body, but nothing like anything I had ever seen. It had no face, just a shadow that seemed to consume the light around it. Don't do this, I managed to whisper, my voice shaking. But the figure moved toward me, slowly, as if waiting for me to make the next move. Terror overwhelmed me, but something inside me rebelled. Whatever that thing was, wasn't my greatest fear. I could feel it. Room 13 was a real threat, the true center of this nightmare. The dark figure wanted to trap me here, wanted me to be another lost soul in this place. But I couldn't let that happen. With tremendous effort, I forced myself to move toward the hallway. My legs were shaking, but I knew I had to go into room 13. There was no more choice. The painting had started speaking, and now it demanded an answer. The door was open, inviting. I was about to cross the threshold when, suddenly, the air around me thickened, grew heavy. The temperature dropped, and a sense of impending death surrounded me. I could feel the presence of the dark being behind me, waiting for my reaction. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. Room 13 was empty. The walls were simple, the furniture rudimentary, but the atmosphere was oppressive. The painting was there, exactly where I expected it, hanging in front of the bed. Its eyes seemed to watch me with even more intensity, as if they already knew I would make it here. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Time seemed distorted inside, as if I was in a space where the rules of reality no longer applied. I approached the painting with the sense that it was pulling me in. The painted face was unrecognizable, but its eyes, those eyes were like portals, looking straight into my soul. I couldn't help it. I was hypnotized, unable to look away. And then the words came. You shouldn't be here. The voice was the same as before. Now, it felt like it was inside my head, an invasive presence. Fear turned into desperation. But at the same time, a strange curiosity took over me. What would happen if I looked closer? What would happen if I touched it? It was as if the painting was challenging me, taunting me. An immense pressure pressed against my chest as I drew closer. I knew I shouldn't touch it, but the temptation was irresistible. With a trembling hand, I touched the frame. and it was as if time had stopped. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, a sensation of sinking into a deep abyss. The room around me began to spin, and reality seemed to warp. There was no more space, no more air. I was being pulled into the painting, as if it were a vortex. The price, the voice whispered again, louder this time. The price must be paid. I couldn't see anything. I could only feel the emptiness, the darkness swallowing my mind. I screamed, trying to pull away, but an invisible force kept me there. My eyes filled with tears, my vision blurred. When I finally managed to pull my hand away from the painting, I fell to the floor, struggling to breathe. The air was back, but I felt as if my soul had been torn from my body. I lifted my eyes, and room 13 was empty again, but it wasn't quiet anymore. I could feel the presence of the dark being somewhere in the room, waiting. I knew something had changed, something inside me. The price the painting demanded wasn't visible, but I knew there was a connection now, a bond between me and that place. The force that had pulled me into the painting was still watching, waiting. And then I heard footsteps again. The feeling of being watched had never been so real. I couldn't tell where my own consciousness ended and where the presence that had been with me since I touched the painting began. Room 13 seemed to have transformed into a silent prison, but one that was thick with tension. Every shadow stretching across the walls seemed alive, like tentacles watching me with invisible eyes. I knew I couldn't leave. Something was stopping me, an invisible, overwhelming force. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly, as if the very spaces inside the motel had warped around me, creating a never-ending maze. I couldn't trust anything anymore. Every corner felt like a threat. Every step felt heavier than the last. When I finally gathered enough composure to look around, I noticed the man from before, the one who had been watching me, was there. He was standing in the doorway of room 13, motionless like a statue, but with an expression of concern I couldn't understand. His eyes were now hollow, lifeless, as if he'd been swallowed by the place itself. He knew, just like I did, that there was no escape anymore. But he wasn't the only one there. The shadowy figure I'd seen earlier, that thing, was now visible, standing out sharply against the dirty walls. Its shape was distorted, a blur that stretched and twisted, yet at the same time, it was something I recognized, something I felt deep in my gut, and it was moving, slowly, but with an unnerving confidence. It was getting closer. I took a step back, but the floor felt like it was sinking beneath my feet, as if it were pulling me down, tempting me. The pressure was unbearable. The air felt heavy, making it hard to breathe. The fear was becoming overwhelming, and I knew that if I didn't make a decision fast, I'd be consumed, swallowed by something even darker. The shadowy figure stopped, watching me. The silence was absolute, but I could feel words forming in my mind, as if this wasn't just a presence anymore, but something real, an entity trying to communicate in a way I couldn't understand. The voice, or whatever it was, started to whisper. The words were unclear, but they sounded like an ancient language, something I couldn't translate, but could feel with an unsettling intensity. The cold grew sharper, and I could see my breath condensing in the air. The fear had reached a point where I didn't know how to control it anymore. It felt like I was being crushed under the weight of something beyond reality. And then I heard a laugh. It was low, almost inaudible, but it was there. A sarcastic laugh, filled with something evil. I didn't know if it came from the figure or from room 13 itself, but the effect was devastating. The laugh grew louder, turning into screams, and the walls started to move as if they were breathing. Something inside me snapped. I took a step toward the door, determined to get out, but something stopped me. It wasn't a hand, it wasn't a physical force, but the sensation of being pulled back, as if the motel were a living entity, consuming me. Room 13 was no longer just a room. It was a pit, a throat that swallowed anything daring enough to enter. The sound of the laugh continued, now closer, as if it were behind me. I knew there was no more time. The shadow was almost upon me, and its eyes, or whatever they were watching me. It was clear now. It wanted something from me. It wasn't just a being, but a force that had been unleashed, fed by my presence. And I had awakened something in its essence, something that couldn't be undone. It was time to play the game. I had two choices, run or accept. Accept the condition the motel demanded from all its visitors. There was no turning back. The painting, the presence, the entity, they all had a price, and now it was my turn to pay. With a deep sigh, I closed my eyes and accepted. There was no sense in resisting anymore. The game was becoming clearer, and I knew that by making this choice, something inside me would change forever. But as soon as I made the choice, I realized that what was coming would be even more terrifying. Suddenly, an explosion of light blinded me, and I felt the weight of the darkness vanish, replaced by a cold emptiness. The voices fell silent. The laughter faded. Room 13 disappeared, and I found myself in a different place. A place that could no longer be recognized, where time didn't exist. I had been transported into something much larger, something beyond the motel, something I couldn't comprehend. Now, I knew. The game had begun. The emptiness around me was vast, like a black hole swallowing light, sound, and color. I was in a space where dimensions folded, where time seemed to slip through my fingers. There was no floor, no ceiling, just a deep darkness and a biting cold that made my skin crawl. I was no longer in the motel, but in something much older and far more terrifying. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost before it even formed. The feeling of suffocating in the darkness was unbearable, as if the very air were against me, trying to strangle me. But as the seconds passed, I realized I wasn't alone. A presence was there. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its weight, as if something were watching every movement I made. It was a feeling of helplessness, as if my soul were being pulled by invisible strings, tied to a force I couldn't comprehend. Then, something began to materialize before me. First, it was a shadow, a dark blotch that twisted and expanded until it became a humanoid shape. It wasn't a person, but something much worse. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, two deep slits from which an eerie light emanated. It was as if it were seeing inside me, seeing every fear, every anguish, every fragment of my soul. I didn't know if this was real or if my mind was beginning to break. The shadow took a step toward me. I tried to move, but my feet were frozen, as if the earth had fused with my skin. The entity approached slowly, its movements precise and agonizingly slow, as if it were savoring every second. I knew the end was near, but I couldn't understand how or why this was happening. It spoke, but not with words. It was a direct communication, a transmission of thoughts, a message that penetrated my mind with terrifying clarity. "You've awakened what was asleep, receptionist." The voice had no sound, but it was everywhere. It echoed in my mind, repeating the same sentence until I couldn't tell if it was a voice or my own consciousness speaking. But the feeling was clear. The entity knew exactly who I was and what I had done. Room 13, the painting, it had all been a trap, a lure to drag me into this place. And now that I was here, there was no turning back. The motel was just the beginning. What you started to touch was much greater, much older. And now, you will be a part of it. The feeling of being pulled, not just physically but spiritually, grew stronger. The darkness around me closed in, forming invisible walls that isolated me. I wanted to fight, I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like the rules of the world I knew had been completely flipped upside down. I was trapped in a nightmare with no way out. Then, a figure appeared in front of me, clearer now. It was a man from the beginning, the one who had been watching me, but he was no longer human. His eyes were hollow, lifeless, and his mouth open, revealing a twisted expression, a grotesque smile that seemed to stretch beyond what was possible. He came closer, and I realized he was no longer just watching me. He was waiting, You're not just in a motel anymore. Not in room 13. What you did, what you touched, it's part of you now. He extended his hand toward me. I knew what that meant. The painting, room 13, the rules. Everything was part of a cycle I now had to fulfill. There was no choice anymore. With tremendous effort, I managed to move a finger. But as I did, I realized I was no longer in control of my own body. Something was shaping me, transforming me. The presence around me seemed to consume me from within, and the darkness overtook my vision. My body bent, as if guided by invisible hands, until my form dissolved, becoming part of the darkness. And when the darkness finally swallowed me whole, I knew the harvest was complete. The motel wasn't just a place. It was a nexus, a web of entities, a prison that trapped people like me, curious, eager, reckless, and turned them into part of an eternal cycle. No matter how far you run, you always come back. And now I'm part of it. I'm the presence at the door of room 13. I'm the man who watches, waiting. And now it's my turn to wait for a new soul who, like me, will get lost and become part of this cursed place. I am the receptionist. I am the rule. I am the motel. I woke up, or at least, I thought I was waking up. The air was warm, heavy, and humid, like a muggy summer morning, but there was something off about it. My body ached, like I had been squeezed between two worlds. I looked around, but there was no more darkness, no more feeling of emptiness. I was back behind the motel's reception desk, exactly where it all started, or at least, that's what I thought. The weak morning light filtered through the curtains, and everything seemed normal. The sound of the fan spinning lazily, the ticking of the wall clock, the stale, musty scent of the place. Nothing was out of place, but something was wrong. There was no longer that sense of comfort one usually feels when returning to the familiar. It was as if the very structure of the motel had warped into something I could no longer comprehend. My hand instinctively reached for the reception drawer, where I kept the guest records. When I opened it, the papers were still there, right where they should be. But as I picked one up, I realized I wasn't looking at ordinary customer names anymore. What lay before me wasn't a simple log. It was a collection of numbers, codes, ancient symbols, and each name was followed by a date, with an enigmatic note written in a language I didn't recognize. Every single entry led to the same destination. Every name had been altered, distorted, as if erased and replaced with something unnatural. I couldn't breathe properly. Then a voice. I heard it before I saw anything. A faint whisper, like the air around me had turned into words. "You won't escape." A chill settled deep into my bones. The voice didn't belong to anyone I knew, yet it was familiar, like an echo of what I had heard in the final moments of my existence. No, not an echo. It was the motel itself speaking to me. It knew I was trying to run, that I wanted to deny the reality I had now found myself trapped in. But that was no longer an option. I lifted my head and looked at the door to room 13. I knew what it meant. I knew what it had become. I had already been there, but now, something deeper was calling me. It was no longer just a room. It was a sentence. And I knew he was watching me. That man. Or rather, the thing he had become. I watched the guests coming and going, oblivious, like puppets on strings. Each of them carried an aura of hopelessness, as if they were being pulled towards something they couldn't escape. With every new visitor, every unfamiliar face, I saw a reflection of myself. I had been next in line, and now it was my turn to be the observer. The phone at the reception rang, shattering the silence. I hesitated, but something inside me forced me to pick up. The voice on the other end was cold. Inhuman. You know what you have to do. Get ready. He's coming. I tried to speak, but my throat closed up. The thread of reality was unraveling before me, and with every second, I felt myself sinking deeper into the motel's game. I was no longer just a receptionist. I was part of it. I was one of the rules. The door to room 13 creaked open slowly. Somehow, I knew I was trapped in this cycle, that there was no real way out anymore. But then, deep in the back of my mind, a final thought formed. One last attempt to break free. Maybe, just maybe, I could warn the next ones. If I could write the truth before I was fully consumed, if I could get the message across, then maybe, just maybe, someone could break the cycle. Or maybe I had already lost, and no one would ever believe the truth. Still, I had to try. I felt the cold weight of the pen in my hand and started writing. The words poured out faster than I expected. A list of rules, just like the ones I had followed, but with one crucial difference. They had to be understood by whoever was about to step inside, by whoever was about to be taken. 1. Do not, under any circumstances, look at the painting in the hallway. 2. Never, ever ask about room 13. 3. If a mysterious guest arrives at midnight, do not check them in. 4. When the phone rings, do not answer it. But as I wrote, a loud noise ripped through the air. The door to room 13 slammed shut. The reception lights flickered. Something had entered. I knew what it meant. I am the receptionist. I am the rule. I am the motel. And somehow, this isn't over.